Hey everybody, it's Leslie Tagorda, your brand navigator, astrologer, and designer. I'm bringing a special episode today. I had a different episode planned, but wow, the events of this last week have been really inspiring to me. I don't know about you, but something just really clicked in me in terms of really standing up and speaking out for what I know to be true. And honestly, I haven't always been this way. I don't know why. Well, actually, I do know why. The events, the horrific events of George Floyd really ignited something in me as well as the world. I mean, in the last week, we had all of the 50 states in the United States have had protests to stand up for Black Lives Matter and just the assaults that have been consistently happening to Black people, since the beginning of this country. And even the world has come out to support us. I think I read just the other day that over 18 countries also had their own protests. So we are at a pivotal time, and I'm really excited to be around and to be doing this work. And so I hope that today you, as a spiritual entrepreneur, are going to learn what you need to do to raise your brand voice with your specific brand values that include social justice. Before we dig into today's episode, I wanted to give a shout out to Shepherdess7 on Apple Podcasts. She says, Leslie is amazing. She is extremely gifted and sweet as can be. The savvy luminary is an absolute essential if you desire to brand yourself and your business as authentically as possible. Thank you, Shepherdess7. Please reach out to me so I can get your snail mail and mail you a Savvy Luminary goodie bag. Now, if you would like to leave a review for me on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, or even simply just rate my podcast, this does so much for the ranking of my podcast in being searchable and visible to other spiritual entrepreneurs like you wanting to use astrology in their business. So earlier this week, I ended up doing this kind of last minute workshop for the full moon eclipse in Sagittarius called Astrology of a Revolution. What inspired me to do this is that I was looking at, I like to look at astrology in terms of giving us clues into getting curious as to what the cosmos and the universe wants us to know about the here and now. The fact that the world is rising up to speak up against oppression and to speak up for Black Lives Matter, there's something bigger in the world. And, we've been talking this whole 2020 about all of the astrological shifts. And, there have been astrologers who have for decades been talking about 2020. And as I was looking at all of the shifts, I kind of put everything into a calendar that I presented during the workshop, Astrology of a Revolution. And it was just like, all of these like seismic shifts that normally happen, every few years, you'll get one every few years. We had like just layers upon layers of them all happening in 2020. So depending on if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you're looking at 2020 as like either the end of the world or the beginning of a new world. And guess what? This Aquarius Sun Jupiter conjunct in the 9th house, me, boss woman, is the eternal optimist. And I see this as the beginning of the new world. Now, I know that most of you, probably all of you here, are transformational impact leaders or light workers or healers or spiritual entrepreneurs of some sort, right? And spiritual entrepreneurship is this kind of funny place, right? There is a lot of appropriation, stealing of spiritual traditions that are not yours and taking it and claiming it as your own, One of my favorite spiritual entrepreneurs, Asha Frost, is an indigenous medicine woman, and she talks about this appropriation all the time. And then we have these other spiritual entrepreneurs who are saying, hey, let's just look at the light and stop focusing on the bad. Well, if you find yourself in any of those situations, you have a lot of work to do. And I'm not calling you out because you specifically have a lot of work to do. We all have a lot of work to do, right? As these cosmic shifts are happening, they're happening to us on a collective level. But how does this then translate into our own personal lives, into our own personal astrology? And so I want to get to a little of that today. So let's talk about spiritual bypassing. So my goodness, all of the events of the last week have really opened my eyes to so many different things, too many things to list here. But so I'm going to focus on spiritual bypassing because, you know, if you've ever found yourself saying, well, let's just focus on the love and light. And, you know, to be honest, I have been there. I have been one of these people not wanting to face the reality and the hardships and the pain of others because of my privilege. Yes, I'm going to say that. I am privileged too, right? Most of us have a sense of privilege. Most of us have a sense of oppression, but we have no idea the oppression, the systematic oppression that Black Americans or Black people across the world face on a daily basis, right? And so there is an educator, I want to call her a thought leader. She's a thought leader, and her name is Rachel Elizabeth Cargill. She's an educator. She doesn't call herself a feminist. She doesn't call herself an anti-racist. She's an intellectual looking at the intersection between race and womanhood. So as I was doing my research on spiritual bypassing, I came across her definition in a beautiful article that she wrote for Harper's Bazaar back in 2018. And she says, spiritual bypassing, the easiest way for white women to skirt around the realities of racism is to just, quote, love and light it away, unquote. When confronted with ways they have offended a marginalized group with their words or actions, they immediately start to demand unity and peace, painting those they harmed as aggressive, mean, or divisive. Now, let's just let that sink in a little bit. Now, she calls out white women because her article from which this is excerpted is called, What is Toxic White Feminism? Now, you don't have to be white to do this spiritual bypassing. There was somebody in my Facebook group, the Savvy Luminary, when I was asking, what do you want to learn about, social impact and astrology? I kind of post questions, and I love to hear people's answers. I take so much pride in having the Savvy Luminary be an inclusive and safe space. And a woman, a regular contributor in my group, she kind of gave this, love and light answer. And so I kindly pointed it out. I literally said, may I kindly define this? I was like, this is called spiritual bypassing, and this is not okay. Please take a look and read more. And, instead of her getting divisive and like really upset about it, she was actually really appreciative. And she went and learned what it meant and how she can do better. Right? So the fact is, all of us are here making mistakes because, hello, we're human and we have so much learning to do. That's part of our human experience. But now the thing about when you make mistakes, which shows the true colors of a person, is what you then do with those mistakes, right? Do you have those mistakes and you just shut them down and stop you in your tracks and, go off hiding? Or maybe you find a mistake and then you make all kinds of excuses about why you made a mistake, or you go on like the defensive track and, further explain why you did this thing. Or the right answer is to get curious at where this mistake happens, where it came from, because there's another whole set of things where these mistakes have come from. Our society that we live in is built on systemic racism. So no matter what color you are, what your background is, we are all swimming in this. And so we have learned racist conditioning, right? So if we get really truth of understanding where our mistakes come from and face the truth, get responsible, get curious, get educated, learn more, and then commit to doing better. We're going to be talking more about that today. So of course, you've probably been hearing a lot about values. And of course, because I talk about branding, we're going to be talking about brand values. And this could also be your personal brand values, the values that you live by, that you are willing to take a stand for, that you're willing to put your life on the line for. I mean, it doesn't have to get that dramatic. I'm not asking you to put your life on the line, but sometimes there are definitely things that call us to do that. So I want to talk about how we can raise our voices using our brand values as an anchor. Now, this is a subject that I've been talking in my membership. I have a paid membership. I call it an immersion program called Luminary Rising. And every month we have some kind of integration challenge for our brand where we work on a really specific thing to elevate our brand and learn more and polish it up so that on our journey to become a thought leader or a spiritual leader in our communities. So I want to share with you a little bit of what I've been teaching my paid membership community about 4 steps to raise your voice with your brand values as your anchor. Let's be clear. I am not a diversity and equity expert or anything like that. My place of being, valuing diversity and inclusion comes just from it comes from the fact that I am multiracial. I am half Filipino and I am half Jewish. I was raised in Hawaii with, Japanese family members, Korean family members. I have gay friends. I have friends of all ages, of all creeds. I love people. And I love hearing people's story. And that's where I come from in this place of equity and inclusion. It's just, I do see color, I do see sexuality, I do see all of these things, and I am open to learning more. I love people. Now, just because I grew up in Hawaii and I am ambiguously multiracial, what is that woman? Most people that I meet new always are like, oh, you must be what I am. Are you from Puerto Rico? Are you from the Dominican? Are you half Black? Are you X, Y, or Z? But the funny thing is the Jewish people never think I'm Jewish and the Filipino people never think I'm Filipino. And from the time I was very little, in my Filipino family, I was called out for being too white. In my Jewish family, I didn't even meet my Jewish grandfather until I was 5 because he wouldn't have it that his daughter married somebody that was Filipino. So I was basically shunned. So I was raised in this kind of place where I never fit in and always being expected to fit in and not be too loud. And so that's why I am here. This is my mission, to give people voice who've been told that your voice wasn't either good enough or deserving enough to be heard. So the more that we raise the opportunities for the most oppressed people, right? The more opportunities and support that we give and create systemically in our own brands to give these opportunities to the most oppressed people, the more we actually elevate and raise the opportunities for all. So there's this wonderful byproduct from raising our voices and supporting everyone. So number 1, you have to claim your brand values. You have to get really clear with what your values are and regularly look at these. We're still in the middle of a Venus retrograde, so this is the perfect time to re-examine your brand values. If you have a ton of brand values, that's not going to help you. You really want to distill them to maybe 5 or 6 core values. Otherwise, you just end up spreading yourself too thin. And if you need a little bit of help with defining your brand values, of course, astrology can help. There are key indicators in astrology on the values that are really aligned to you. For me, on my second house cusp, I have Cancer. And at the highest level, Cancer is a archetype, a nurturing archetype that creates safe communities. And so, yeah, so creating these equitable and inclusive communities comes naturally to me. And not only do I value them, but my business adds value by creating them. Another one of my brand values is learning from mistakes. Basically, I kind of interpret this as like, we're all here to learn from our mistakes and not be perfect. So another interpretation of that is perfectly imperfect, right? So another thing is creating opportunities for girls and women. There's a set of brand values that I hold dear to myself personally, as well as that I then apply into my business. Because for all of us, the way that we make money, the way we run our businesses, they are an extension of our purpose, of our personal consciousness, right? So step one, claim your brand values. 5 or 6 at the top. Number 2, after you've claimed your brand values, it's not just enough to have a list and have it, my values, and then maybe I'll post it on my website somewhere, right? Now you have to, step 2 is you need to define what your values mean in your business. Okay, so maybe you write a manifesto. Maybe you talk about these values and, write little paragraphs for each of the values that really define it specifically for your brand. Because diversity and inclusion and safe spaces mean something different for my brand as a brand astrologer than it does for a nonprofit who's giving, helping families obtain affordable housing. Even though these two businesses could use the same value, it means different things for each of those organizations. So what does each of your brand values mean for your business? What can you tell your customers and your fans about what you stand for and why you stand for it and how you define it, right? That's why manifestos are so great. But then again, manifestos can't just be hiding on a website, or just, giving to your contractors. They need to be communicated to your customers and fans. Step 3, right? So now you can't just say, I have these values, I've defined these values. Now you have to activate these values in the daily practices of your business, right? This is something that I learned how to define. This is something that I've talked about in my business, but I learned this great tool from a woman who teaches diversity and equity for corporations as well as individuals and businesses. Her name is Trudy Lebrun, and she has another podcast called Business Remixed. And one of the things that she says is that intention is not enough. And if you've been following me for a while, you've heard me say that as well, especially with these new moon intentions. You can't just plant the seed and let it go. Well, sometimes you can. I guess if in a forest, the forest takes care of the seed. But for us in our soilless gardens, we have to tend these seeds, right? We have to fertilize and water and prune them, right? So that's what I'm talking about, activating, right? Once you have these values, what are you going to do with them next, right? Do you have like daily and weekly and monthly and annual systems that really allow you to integrate these values in your business, right? So again, I say that I create safe and open spaces, not only in my brands, but also the community for this podcast, The Savvy Luminary. So, what I mean, how I bake this into my community is that when I say I create safe and open spaces, I am, constantly looking at all of the comments, making sure, calling people out if it's not okay, opening up discussions to hearing people and what they need right now. So, in my community over this last week, because I've been talking so much about social justice, it has been really triggering for a lot of people, especially in my group. There are a lot of Black people, and I'm so glad that there are so many Black spiritual entrepreneurs in my group. And one woman reached out to me and she asked if she could share a very, very raw and vulnerable story of racism that happened to her as a young girl. And so we had a phone call. She told her story to me. She wanted me to share the story. So I rewrote the story. I followed up with her. I asked her if the story told her story in the words that she wanted. I didn't want to, misinterpret anything. I didn't want to put words into her mouth. I wanted to make sure I got her story right. And then I shared it. And then I monitored comments just in case anything was going to come up that wasn't going to be great. And then I followed up with her privately just to see how she was doing. And oh my gosh, it was such a beautiful experience. And I'm honored to have been able to hold that space for her. And that's what it means to create a safe space, to make sure that everybody feels like they belong. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, a dear friend of mine, she sent me a message and she says, I have to leave your group. This is all just too much for me. I am tired of always talking about racism and the pain and the fear that she holds. And I have to be open with that too, to respect her experience and support her in the way that she wants to be supported, right? It's not about, I'm creating the space, and yes, I have the ability to say what happens or not, but I want to make sure that everybody has a sense of belonging, right? If we go back to the Cancer values, the Cancer archetype values, belonging is that part of the safe space. Another thing, that we can do in our business is by creating opportunities, right? If you're hiring somebody, or if you're looking for a collaborator, reaching out, of course, to people that are like-minded with you, but also making sure that the opportunities that you're presenting, that you're not just asking people of color just to check off a diversity checklist. Like, you're actually giving opportunities for people because you respect and desire other people's perspectives, because their study upon study has been shown that diversity is better for us all. It's the shallowest mention of diversity. It's just complexion. But at the highest level of diversity, it's all of these beautiful perspectives that come in with equal footing to get to share their voice. Which leads us to the next thing with your systems. Are you giving voice to underrepresented voices that have a hard time speaking up? Right? Like, so for me, as an example, as a Filipina astrologer, my voice is automatically, a lot less loud than, say, like a white astrologer, just giving an example, right? I don't have as many opportunities. I haven't been given as many opportunities. So are there people that you can raise up? Are there people that you respect their information, you're sharing and crediting where you've gotten this information? And this doesn't just go for like giving voice to people of color. This goes to giving people a voice to older people, younger people, people of different sexual orientations. There's so many different ways that you can give voice to people who are not normally heard, right? The other thing is, like, are you constantly speaking up, right? Are you speaking up for your values, knowing how this is rippling out in the world? Are you supporting other people who share your same values? Are you contributing to the organizations that share your values? So do a check-in with your brand values for your business and see how you're actually living those values versus just saying, oh, I have these values. All right, step 4 is standing up for these values, right? A little bit different than like living these values. Now you are standing up for these values. You're sharing the values, you're spreading the values, and you're standing up and calling out when there's something wrong that is not right to you. Now, this can be super scary to take a stand, right? Because God knows that women, people of color, we have been forced to be quiet for way too long. And that when we do take a stand, there are so many repercussions. Getting fired, getting killed sometimes, like there are a lot of risks. But you as a business owner, right? You as a transformational impact leader, you are here to call it out and take a stand. Now, because we've been seeing so much of this spiritual bypassing or this kind of in our spiritual world, people doing just kind of what some people are calling performative activism, where they're saying Black Lives Matter, but there's nothing else part of their brand that like supports that, or they're mentioning oppression but not really saying like this is for Black Americans. Take a stand when you see the wrongdoing, and don't get so stuck in like like I'm going to unfollow, I'm going to unsubscribe, I'm going to like cancel. I want you to get curious again. Like for me as a Gemini rising, I lead with curiosity. I want to understand. I want to see people's responses, right? Like we talked about this a little bit in the beginning. Are there excuses coming up? Is there just a total shutdown of the conversation? Is there real, like sincere regret with the promise to do better, right? Once you see the response, that's when you can base your next step accordingly. So for everybody, just to review the 4 steps to raise your voice with your brand values as your anchor. 1, claim your brand values and maybe re-examine them, especially during this Venus retrograde time. 2, explicitly define your values in your business. What does it mean, right? How can you describe what it means specifically for your organization? Number 3, activate and live those values. Don't just talk about it, but then really implement those values in your day-to-day operations. And number 4, stand up for those values. Call it out, take a stand, right? Again, mistakes happen, so get curious. Do the work of a true light worker, a true spiritual entrepreneur, a true transformational impact leader, right? Because you already know this, that changing the world, we all want to change the world here, starts with changing ourselves. Well, thank goodness we have a kind of a quiet week for the week of June 7th through June 13th. We're in between the full moon and the new moon eclipse. And next week we have Mercury Retrograde as well as the new moon eclipse coming, and all about Cancer season. So we're going to get, blasted through another wave. We're just able to pull our heads up, take a deep breath before we get swept under with all of the cosmic shifts that are happening, right? So on Thursday, June 11th, we have the Sun square Neptune. When we think about the Sun, our radiant creative expression, as well as Neptune, our imaginative and most spiritual selves, this is a great, to me, I don't see this as necessarily as a trigger. I see this as just a lot of energy to start radiating out your spiritual, spiritual activism. But, this comes just 2 days before we have an exact conjunction between Mars, our planet of motivation, as well as Neptune. So on Saturday, June 13th, we have another aspect with Neptune. So both of these aspects are happening kind of at the same time. They're all, these two aspects that I'm talking about on June 11th and June 13th, they happen exact. But, these energies are building up and they're really related, right? Because when Mars, our motivation and our activation and our activism and our drive to physically move and make things happen is next to Neptune, which is more imaginative, more visionary, more, the undertow of the depths and mysticism, right? When we have these two things, again, it is really reinforcing this place of spiritual activism. So I have no idea as I'm recording this today, what's going to happen, in the next week, if we're going to have more protests, if something bigger is going to happen. But I do know that the best way to combat this is to get really centered to one's highest self and inner knowing, and to get curious with what that inner knowing wants us to do and how it wants us to show up as a spiritual leader to lead the change. I was mentioning earlier my workshop that I did during the full moon eclipse in Sagittarius called Astrology for a Revolution. We are putting the final touches on our Patreon. I'm super excited to bring Patreon because we have all of this content that we create every month. We have new moon worksheets. We're putting together an astrological calendar for entrepreneurs. And I want to share some of these highlights from this talk, Astrology for Activism, because even though we're halfway through the year, all of the things that we have felt up through summer solstice, we haven't quite reached summer solstice yet, but everything that we've experienced in the last 6 months still have the ripple effect forward throughout the rest of 2020. So reviewing the astrology for 2020 has a huge impact, and you can see why we are at just the beginning of a new paradigm. I am so excited about this. So, if you go to Patreon, we'll have different levels, and you can join on one of those levels and get some highlights from the replay of Astrology for a Revolution. Well, that's all I have for this week. Next week, we are going to be talking about Mercury Retrograde, our second of the year that will be going through Cancer. We are currently in the Cancer, in the shadow zone of Mercury Retrograde. So basically during the shadow zone, this is the place where Mercury will be retracing its steps backwards. So Mercury is currently stepping on the brakes, slowing down before it comes to a stop, right? So next week, all about Mercury Retrograde. I am also putting together a course, a little mini course called Mercury Survival / Revival Kit. So I know that people start to freak the F out around Mercury retrogrades, and you don't have to. It's actually a time of revival. So I know I can't say it out loud, survival / revival, but if you spell it out, you'll see that I cross out the SUR from survival and I replace it with an RV to celebrate our upcoming Mercury retrograde so we can go through and redo so much more of our learning. All right, until next week. So again, please join the movement. Hop on over to the Savvy Luminary. It's a free Facebook group for spiritual entrepreneurs wanting to use astrology. And of course, I'll let you know when Patreon comes online. And always, I'm so grateful for any rating and review that you leave or sharing an episode to one of your spiritual business besties. Until next week, talk to you later. Bye. Mahalo for listening to this brand new podcast. If you enjoyed learning about astrology for entrepreneurs, help me spread the word by sharing this podcast with your business besties, and hop over to the Savvy Luminary for links to episode notes and our free Facebook community where you can send me questions about astrology or branding, as well as connect with other like-minded businesses.